My sister-in-law humiliated me at her rehearsal, called me the hired help who got lucky in front of 40 of her closest friends. And by sunrise, I had not just cancelled her wedding. I had taken back everything my family thought belonged to them. The Windsor ballroom was glowing the way I'd designed it to glow. Amber light low against ivory linen, magnolias flown in that morning, a string quartet tuning quietly in the corner. Camille stood at the center of it in a champagne gown, glass raised, and I watched her decide, in real time, that this was the moment to make her point in front of an audience. "Everyone," she said, tapping her fork against crystal until even the musicians lowered their bows, "before tomorrow, I have to say something. My brother married the hired help." A ripple of laughter. Some uneasy, some not uneasy enough. "And somehow, 12 years later, she owns the building we are standing in. Isn't that something? Lucky for us. Tonight, we get the Windsor for free." I did not flinch. I have spent a lifetime training my face not to hand people the reaction they are hunting for. But what Camille didn't know. What none of them knew, standing there in my ballroom, drinking my champagne, laughing at my expense. Is that this toast was not a spontaneous cruelty. I had heard, 3 weeks earlier, secondhand, that Camille had told her bridesmaids she planned to put Evelyn in her place before the wedding, once and for all, because she was tired of pretending to be grateful to someone who only got rich off marrying into this family. I had heard it and let it go, the way I let everything go, because I told myself family doesn't keep score. I was wrong to let it go, and I was about to stop. I set my glass down, thanked the room with a warmth that gave nothing away, and walked out to my car in the cool October air. Before I tell you exactly what I did next, tell me in the comments. Have you ever smiled through the worst insult of your life, because you already knew you held the only card that mattered? Here is what Camille did not know. She did not know that the free venue had never been free at all. That Sterling had quietly financed the difference through my company's credit line, without telling me, for the 3rd time in 2 years. She did not know that I had spent the last month, after hearing about her bridesmaid comment, doing something I had never done in 12 years of marriage. I had quietly, legally, audited every dollar that had moved through our shared financial life, and she did not know that the contract she'd signed for the Windsor Ballroom. Page 6, Section 14, Conduct and Representation. Was a clause I had written myself, 4 years ago, specifically to protect me from exactly this kind of night. I drove to my office instead of home. I opened the folder. I read the clause once more, though I already knew it by heart, and I picked up the phone and called Denise, my operations director, the one person besides my lawyer, who had earned my full trust. "I need the Whitfield contract terminated tonight," I said. Section 14. Immediate breach. Locks changed by 6 a.m., equipment pulled by 7. Denise was quiet a moment. "That's the wedding tomorrow, Evelyn." "I know exactly what it is," I said. "And Denise. While you're in the system tonight, pull every transaction tied to the Camille Whitfield LLC. All of it. I want a full picture before the sun comes up." I could hear her sit up straighter through the phone. "You think there's more than the venue?" "I think," I said, looking at the folder open in front of me, at Camille's careless signature, at a year of quiet withdrawals I had only begun to understand, there is a great deal more than the venue. Tonight, we start with what's easy. Tomorrow, we find out how deep this actually goes. I hung up, and I sat alone in my dark office with the ballroom's glow still visible through the window, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel something other than grace, not rage, something colder, more patient, more dangerous than rage. The specific clarity of a woman who has just realized exactly how much power she's been sitting on, and exactly how long she's been too gracious to use it. Camille thought she'd embarrassed me in front of 40 people. She had no idea that by morning, her wedding would be the smallest thing she lost. The first call came at 5:52 in the morning, and by then I had already been awake for over an hour, sitting at my kitchen table with the folder from the night before open in front of me, adding to it. Sterling's name lit up my phone screen, followed by 3 missed calls I hadn't heard from the venue's emergency line, followed by a 4th. I let it ring twice before I answered, because I have learned that the person who answers first is usually the person who ends up apologizing first, and I intended to do neither that morning. "Evelyn." His voice was low, urgent, already reaching for damage control before he understood there was no controlling this. Denise called Camille an hour ago. She's saying the venue's locked, the whole thing is cancelled. What did you do? I didn't do anything, I said, pouring myself another cup of coffee, my voice as even as still water. Camille did, last night, in front of 40 guests, at an event held under a signed agreement with my company. She violated the conduct clause. I enforce the contract the way it's written to be enforced. That's not me doing something. Sterling. That's a business protecting itself. It's my sister's wedding day. It was, I said. Now it's a breach of contract. And Sterling. While I have you. I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer, because I already know part of the truth, and I will know if you lie to me. Silence. The particular silence of a man recalculating, in real time, exactly how much ground he still had left to stand on. The Windsor line of credit, I said. How many times, over the last 2 years, have you drawn against it without telling me? The silence stretched long enough that I could hear, faintly, Camille's voice rising somewhere behind him, sharp with the particular panic of a woman discovering that a thing she'd assumed was permanent had never been hers to assume at all. Evelyn, he said finally, I can explain everything, I promise you, but not over the phone, not like this. You have until tonight, I said. After that, I stop asking, and I start finding out on my own, and I promise you, Sterling. I am considerably better at finding things than you are at hiding them. I hung up before he could answer, and I sat with my coffee going cold in front of me, and I let myself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of 12 years compressed into a single morning. Then I did what I always do when the ground shifts beneath me. I went back to work. I drove to the office at 7, past the Windsor ballroom's darkened windows, past the parking lot where a florist's van sat idling in confusion, the driver on his phone, clearly having just learned that the wedding he'd been contracted for no longer existed. I did not stop. I had learned, over 12 years in this business, that the moment you start explaining yourself to vendors who aren't your direct responsibility, you invite exactly the kind of chaos that erodes a decision before it's even had a chance to hold. Denise was already at her desk when I arrived, dark circles under her eyes that told me she hadn't slept either. I pulled everything, she said, without preamble, sliding a folder across her desk before I'd even set down my bag. 18 months of transaction history on the Windsor line of credit, cross-referenced against actual invoices. Evelyn, I need you to sit down before you look at this. I did not sit down. I have never once in my professional life needed to be told to brace myself before bad news, because I have built my entire career on the principle that you meet difficult information standing on your own 2 feet, ready to act on it immediately rather than absorbing it lying down. The first page was the $11,000 from Camille's raw bar upgrade, wired 2 days before the wedding. The transaction Sterling had already admitted to. I had expected that one. The second page was a withdrawal from 8 months earlier. $6,000, memoed simply as consulting.sw, routed to an LLC I did not recognize. I had not expected that one, though something in me, some old, tired intuition I had spent years training myself to ignore, recognized the shape of it. Immediately. Keep going, Denise said quietly. The third page nearly took the floor out from under me in a way the first 2 hadn't, because it wasn't Camille's name at all. It was a name I recognized from a Christmas party 4 years ago. A woman Sterling had introduced as an old colleague from his firm, Renata Ashworth. And beside her name, a running list of transfers stretching back nearly 2 years, totaling, when Denise had finished adding them, $43,000. I don't understand what I'm looking at, I said, though some cold, clear part of me already did. Denise's voice, when she finally spoke, was gentle in the specific way people are gentle when they are about to hand you something they know will change the entire shape of your life. I made a call this morning, before you got in. I know the office manager at Sterling's firm. We went to college together. Evelyn, Renata Ashworth doesn't work as a consultant anymore. She left the firm 18 months ago. Denise paused, and I watched her decide, in real time, whether to say the rest of it, and then say it anyway, because she had known me long enough to understand that I would rather have the whole truth standing up than half of it lying down. She lives in a condo in Buckhead now. Sterling's name is on the lease. I stood very still in Denise's office, the morning light coming pale through the blinds, $43,000 of my company's money laid out across a desk in someone else's handwriting, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its coldness, that I had spent this entire morning asking the wrong question. I had been asking how deep Camille's betrayal went. I had never once thought to ask how deep my husband's went. Until right now, standing in this office, looking at a lease with his name on it and a woman's name beside it that was not mine. Get Patricia on the phone, I said. And Denise. Cancel my site visits today. All of them. I think I'm going to need the entire day. Patricia's voice, when she picked up, carried the particular alertness of a lawyer who has learned to recognize crisis in the first 3 words of a client's greeting. Tell me everything, she said, starting with why Denise called me before you did. I told her. I laid it out in order, the way I lay out every difficult thing in my life. The venue breach, the $11,000, the $43,000 spread across 2 years, and finally, the lease in Buckhead with my husband's name on it beside a woman's name that was not mine. Patricia was quiet long enough that I could hear her pen moving against paper. Okay, she said finally. I want to separate this into 2 problems, because they are not the same problem, even though they feel like the same problem right now. Problem 1 is the business. Sterling drew against a company line of credit that requires dual authorization over $5,000, and he doesn't have it. That's a contract issue, and it's clean. We can freeze his access today, no argument required. Problem 2 is your marriage, and Evelyn, I want to be honest with you, that one is not going to be clean, and it is not going to be fast, but you do not have to solve both problems on the same day. You only have to protect yourself today. The rest can happen at whatever pace you decide. I don't want to protect myself slowly, I said. I want to understand exactly what I'm protecting myself from, all of it, before I make a single decision I can't undo. Then let's start with what's provable, Patricia said. I'll have the bank freeze Sterling's draw authority within the hour. I'll also request the full lease documentation on the Buckhead property. If his name is on it, it's a public record, and I can have it in front of you by this afternoon. In the meantime, Evelyn, I need to ask you something. And I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Do you want this quiet, or do you want this documented in a way that protects you completely, even if it eventually becomes public? I looked out the window of my office at the courtyard below, where a bride and groom were taking engagement photos near the fountain, unaware that the woman watching them from 3 floors up had spent the morning discovering the exact architecture of her own marriage's collapse. Documented, I said. Completely. I have spent 12 years being gracious in private so that everyone else's comfort could stay intact. I am done making that trade. Understood, Patricia said. I'll have Marcus in accounting build a full forensic timeline. Every transaction, every date, cross-referenced against Sterling's known relationship with Ms. Ashworth, as far back as we can establish it. If this needs to hold up somewhere formal eventually, I want it airtight from the very beginning. I hung up, and I sat alone in my office for a long moment, and then I did the thing I had been avoiding since Denise first said the name Renata Ashworth out loud. I opened my personal phone, and I looked, for the first time in longer than I could admit, at the small, curated slice of Sterling's life he'd let me see over the past 2 years. Golf trips with old colleagues. A work conference in Charleston I now remembered had fallen exactly 1 week after the Buckhead lease's start date. A Christmas party photo where a woman I now recognized stood just slightly too close to my husband's shoulder, smiling at the camera, with the particular ease of someone who already understood something the rest of the room did not. I had seen all of it before. I had simply never let myself look. Camille called 4 times that afternoon, each one going straight to voicemail, because I had decided, somewhere around 11 that morning, that I no longer owed her family the courtesy of managing her panic on top of everything else. Sterling texted twice. Can we talk tonight? And then, an hour later, Evelyn, please. I know this looks bad. And I did not answer either message, because I had learned, over the course of one very long morning, that the version of the truth a frightened man offers you before you've gathered your own evidence is never the whole truth. It is only the part he thinks you can survive hearing. Patricia called back at 4 with the lease documents, and I read them standing at my office window, alone, the courtyard below empty now, the bride and groom long gone, with their photographs of a future they still believed was simple. The lease was signed 14 months ago. Sterling's name, and beside it, Renata Ashworth's, on a 2-bedroom condo in Buckhead with a monthly rent that matched, almost to the dollar, several of the consulting withdrawals Denise had flagged that morning. I want to tell you what I felt, reading that document alone in my office at 4 in the afternoon, because I think it matters more than anything Camille ever said to me in a ballroom. I did not feel surprised. I felt, instead, a kind of grief that had been waiting patiently for over a year to finally be allowed into the room. Grief not for the affair itself, though that grief was real and would take its own time, but for every small moment over the past 14 months when I had chosen, quietly, to trust rather than to look. Every late night I hadn't questioned, every business trip I'd taken at face value, every ounce of grace I had extended to a man who had been spending my company's money to keep another woman comfortable in an apartment 14 minutes from the house we shared. I folded the lease carefully and placed it in the folder beside everything else. Camille's contract, the withdrawal history, the timeline Patricia's team was still building. And I understood, standing there in the last light of that long afternoon, that this was no longer a story about a rehearsal dinner toast. Camille's cruelty had been the crack in the door. What waited behind it was so much larger than anything she alone could have caused. I picked up my phone and typed a single text to Sterling, the only words I had left for him that day. Come home tonight. Bring your key to the office. We are done pretending either of us doesn't already know. Sterling arrived at 7, and I watched him walk into our kitchen already wearing the face of a man who has spent an entire day rehearsing an explanation, and arrived home to discover it wasn't going to matter. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand, one more time, that this has never been how I move through the world, no matter how much the moment might have earned it. I sat at the head of our kitchen table with the folder closed in front of me, and I let him stand there a moment in the silence, because I have learned that silence, held long enough, does more work than any accusation could. Sit down, I said finally, and he sat. Evelyn, I know what this looks like. I don't want to know what it looks like, I said. I want to know what it is. Renata Ashworth. 14 months on a lease in Buckhead, $43,000 of my company's money keeping her comfortable in it. Tell me the truth, Sterling, in one sentence. And then we can decide what happens to the rest of this conversation. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something in his face finally give way. Not relief, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a lie so long that even confessing it feels like setting down a weight he'd forgotten he was holding. It started as an affair, he said. It became something else. I don't expect you to understand that, or forgive it. I'm not asking you to. Good, I said, because I wasn't going to. How long? 2 years, he said. Almost. It started around the time the Ashford location opened, when you were traveling constantly for the build-out. I told myself it was loneliness. I told myself a lot of things, Evelyn, and none of them make it better. I know that. I sat with that number. 2 years. And let it settle next to everything else I had learned in the past 24 hours, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I felt something other than devastation. I felt clarity. Cold and total. The same clarity I feel standing in front of a contract that has finally revealed which clause protects me and which one doesn't. Here is what happens now, I said. You are going to move out tonight, not next week. Tonight. I have already had a room prepared at the Ashford Point, one of our own suites. So don't mistake this for generosity. I simply want you somewhere I can account for. Patricia will file for divorce Monday morning. The $43,000, along with everything Camille owes, will be treated as a business matter first, a marital matter second. I want every dollar back, with interest, and I want it documented in a way that makes clear exactly how it left this company and exactly whose signature authorized it. Evelyn, please, can we just... No, I said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, my voice sharpened, not loud, but absolutely final. We are not going to talk our way backward into a version of this where I quietly absorb another loss, because it's easier for everyone else. I have spent 12 years being the wall this family leans on. I am done being asked to hold weight I never agreed to carry. He left an hour later, a single suitcase, the house going quiet around me in a way it hadn't been quiet in over a decade. I sat alone in the kitchen and allowed myself, finally, 3 minutes of grief. Real, unguarded, my forehead against my own folded arms. Before I lifted my head, wiped my face, and opened my laptop. Because here is the thing I understood, sitting alone in that kitchen, Sterling's affair was his failure to answer for, but the $43,000 was mine to recover, and Camille's public humiliation was mine to answer. And I intended to answer both with the same tool I have used my entire career to answer everything. Precision. I opened a new document and began to build what I would, over the following 2 weeks, come to think of privately as the reckoning, not a tantrum, not a scene. A structure. Legal, financial, and public, in that precise order. Designed so that by the time anyone in that family understood what was happening to them, there would be no version of events left to argue with. The first call I made that night was not to a lawyer. It was to a reporter I'd met 3 years earlier at a small business awards dinner, a woman who covered local business and consumer protection for the Atlanta paper, who had once told me, half joking, that she'd love to write about what actually happens behind the pretty tablecloths in the wedding industry someday. Sandra, I said, when she picked up. It's Evelyn Carrington. I think I finally have that story for you. Part 5. Sandra Whitfield-Reyes. No relation to my husband's family. A coincidence I noted with something close to dark amusement. Met me for coffee 2 days later, notebook open, recorder placed carefully between us on the table. I want to be clear about what I'm bringing you, I told her, and what I'm not. I'm not asking you to write a piece about my marriage. That's mine to handle privately, through my lawyer. And it will be handled. What I'm bringing you is a pattern. And I think it's a pattern your readers, especially the ones planning weddings in this city, deserve to understand. I laid out, methodically, what Denise's forensic review had uncovered over the past week. Camille's boutique, it turned out, hadn't simply been failing quietly. She had been taking deposits from her own bridal clients. Full payment for custom gown alterations, promised delivery dates that came and went. While using incoming client funds to cover rent and payroll rather than the actual garments owed. A pattern accounting call. Constructive fraud. Once enough of it accumulates in one place, Denise had found it almost by accident, cross-referencing the LLC's incoming transfers against public reviews left by brides who'd never received their dresses, women who'd assumed, reading Camille's smiling Instagram apology about the venue drama, that their own missing gowns were somehow unrelated. You're telling me your sister-in-law has been running what's functionally a small Ponzi scheme out of a bridal boutique, Sandra said slowly, funded partly by money drawn from your company without your knowledge. I'm telling you, I said, that I have 11 brides' names, 11 public complaints, and a forensic accountant's report showing exactly where their deposits went instead of into their dresses. I'm telling you that a woman with 40,000 followers built her entire public image this year on being the wronged party in a wedding day scandal, while quietly failing to deliver merchandise to actual, real brides who trusted her with their savings. I think that's a story that matters regardless of what she said to me at a rehearsal dinner. I just happen to also know exactly where to find the paperwork. Sandra was quiet for a moment, professional caution working behind her eyes. I'll need to verify all of this independently. I won't run anything based solely on documents from an estranged family member. I'd be disappointed in you if you did, I said, and I meant it, because I had not built my life on convincing people to trust me blindly. I had built it on giving them exactly enough verifiable truth that they never had to. I gave her Denise's contact information for the financial side, gave her the public reviews she could find herself without my help, and gave her, finally, the name and number of a bride named Keisha Monroe, a nurse who had paid $4,000 for a custom gown 8 months earlier and never received it, who had left a single devastated review on Camille's page that had been quietly buried beneath hundreds of wedding day sympathy comments. I did not tell Sandra what to write. I want that understood clearly, because I did not need to. I had simply, finally, stopped protecting people from the consequences of the truth. While that story moved slowly through its own machinery, Patricia and I moved through ours. The divorce filing went in on Monday, exactly as promised, and with it, a formal demand for repayment of the $43,000 traced to the Buckhead lease, structured not as a marital asset dispute, but as an unauthorized business withdrawal. A distinction Patricia assured me would matter enormously in how quickly the money could be recovered, since it moved the conversation out of the slow architecture of divorce court and into the much faster, much less forgiving territory of commercial account fraud. Sterling called 4 times that week. I answered once. Patricia says you're treating this like I stole from a stranger, he said, his voice cracking in a way I might once have found unbearable to hear. I'm not a stranger, Evelyn. I'm your husband. You were my husband, I said, when you signed a lease for another woman using money that belonged to a company I built alone. I didn't make you a stranger, Sterling, you made yourself one withdrawal at a time, over 2 years, while I was still calling you my partner. I'm simply the first person in this family, in longer than I can remember, who's decided to respond to the truth instead of managing everyone's comfort around it. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect one. Camille, for her part, seemed to sense the shift in the wind before she understood its source. Her texts, which had spent the first week alternating between fury and performative grief, went quiet entirely for 4 days. And then, on the 5th day, Sandra's first inquiry call reached her, asking politely for comment regarding several customer complaints about undelivered custom orders, and my phone lit up within the hour. What are you doing to me? The message read. A reporter just called asking about my clients. Evelyn, is this you? I looked at that message for a long moment, standing in my office with the courtyard quiet below me, and I thought about a ballroom 3 weeks earlier, 40 guests laughing at a joke made at my expense, a woman in a champagne dress, who had never once, in 12 years, asked whether the wall she leaned on had a name of her own. I did not respond. Some questions, I had learned, answer themselves best in silence. The article ran 9 days later, above the fold on the paper's business section website, and by 9 that morning it had already been shared past the small circle of local readers who normally cared about consumer protection stories into the much larger, much hungrier current of people who love watching a carefully built public image come apart in real time. Behind the veil, how one Atlanta bridal boutique left brides without dresses. And without answers. Sandra had done exactly what she'd promised. She had not written a word about me, about Sterling, about the rehearsal dinner, about the marriage quietly dissolving in a lawyer's office 3 miles from where Camille's boutique sat with its windows still dressed in white silk and fairy lights. She had written, instead, about Keisha Monroe, the nurse who never got her gown, and about 10 other women just like her. A paralegal, a school teacher, a woman who had saved for 2 years working double shifts at a diner to afford a dress for her daughter's wedding, only to be told, 3 weeks before the ceremony, that there had been a supplier delay, a phrase that meant, as the forensic accounting Sandra had independently verified made clear, that her deposit had gone toward payroll 6 months earlier and never come back. I read the article once, standing in my kitchen with coffee going cold beside me, the same kitchen where this entire story had begun with a phone call at 5:52 in the morning weeks before. I felt no triumph reading it. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters. What I felt instead was something quieter and heavier. The particular grief of watching 11 strangers' pain finally receive the attention it had always deserved, attention that had been buried for months beneath sympathy comments about a wedding day scandal that had never been the real scandal at all. Camille's Instagram went dark by noon, not deleted. I checked, more than once, telling myself it was simply due diligence. But the comments had been disabled, the most recent posts scrubbed from public view, the account retreating into the particular silence of a person who has run out of narratives to offer. The calls started that afternoon, not from Camille, from her mother. Evelyn, Ruth said, when I finally answered on the 4th attempt, her voice carrying none of its usual careful composure. Please. I know things have been terrible between you and Sterling, and I know Camille said something unforgivable at that dinner, but this. Brides are calling for a criminal investigation, Evelyn. Her lawyer says she could be looking at fraud charges. She's my daughter. She's also 11 other women's cautionary tale, I said, Women who worked double shifts and skipped vacations to save for a dress they never received, while your daughter used their money to fund a lifestyle she couldn't otherwise afford and asked my husband to quietly cover the rest with money that wasn't his to give. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for her, Ruth said. I'm asking if there's anything you can do, you know people, you know that reporter. I stood at my window, looking down at the same courtyard where I'd once watched an oblivious bride and groom take engagement photos, and I thought carefully before I answered, because I understood this was the moment the entire family had been waiting for without knowing it. The moment they would find out, finally, whether Evelyn's grace had any actual limit, or whether it truly was as bottomless as they had always assumed. Ruth, I said, I didn't do this to Camille. I gave a reporter a set of facts that were already true, about a business she was already running dishonestly, using clients who were never mine to protect. If those facts have consequences, those consequences belong to her, the same way the consequences of her toast at that rehearsal dinner belonged to her, and the same way the consequences of Sterling's affair belonged to him. I spent 12 years absorbing the consequences of this family's choices, so none of you ever had to sit with them. I am not doing that anymore, not for Camille, not for Sterling, not for anyone. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I began to wonder if she'd hung up. You've changed, Ruth finally said, and I could hear, underneath the accusation, something that might have been fear. No, I said. I've simply stopped hiding how much I'd already changed years ago, back when I first realized what this family actually thought I was for. I ended the call gently, because I have never once in my life needed to slam a door to make my point, and I sat with the quiet that followed, feeling the particular, unfamiliar lightness of a woman who has finally stopped managing everyone else's comfort at the expense of her own clarity. Patricia called an hour later, with an update I had been expecting since the moment Sandra's article went live. 2 of the 11 brides named in the piece had already retained an attorney of their own and filed a formal complaint with the Georgia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. A criminal referral, Patricia explained, was likely within the week, given the scale and duration of the pattern. There's something else, Patricia said. The bank finished its internal review on the Windsor line of credit today. Given the scale of the unauthorized draws. Sterling's, and the ones connected to Camille's LLC. They are treating this as a formal fraud case on their end too. Separate from your divorce filing, Evelyn. I want you to understand what that means. This is no longer just a family matter you're managing quietly. It's now, officially, a matter for the bank's fraud division and, likely soon, the state's as well. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, finally, the true size of what had started with a single toast in a ballroom 3 weeks ago. Good, I said. Let it be exactly as large as it actually is. I spent 12 years making myself small enough to fit inside everyone else's comfort. I have absolutely no interest in doing that with the truth. The formal fraud referral moved faster than any of us expected, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not orchestrate its speed. The Attorney General's office, once 2 attorneys, and a forensic paper trail landed on their desk, needed no further encouragement from me. By the following Tuesday, Camille's business accounts had been frozen pending investigation, and by Thursday, a second reporter. This one from a larger regional outlet that had picked up Sandra's original story. Was camped outside the boutique's shuttered storefront, filming its dark windows for the evening broadcast. I did not watch the segment live. Denise sent it to me afterward, and I watched it once, alone in my office, the same office where this entire unraveling had begun with a folder and a phone call. The footage showed the boutique's white silk curtains, undisturbed and untouched. A padlock now hanging from the front door beside a notice from the state. The anchor's voice, calm and practiced, described a pattern of alleged fraud spanning nearly 2 years, involving deposits from at least 14 brides across the greater Atlanta area. 14 now, 3 more having come forward once the story broke wide enough for strangers with the same story to finally recognize each other. I felt no satisfaction watching it. I want to be precise about that, because I think it's the most important thing I can tell you about revenge, real revenge, the kind that actually happens rather than the kind people fantasize about in the heat of humiliation. It does not feel like winning. It feels like watching a structure you always suspected was hollow finally, publicly, prove itself hollow. And understanding that you had no more power to prevent that collapse than you had power to have caused it in the first place. I had not destroyed Camille's business. Camille's business had destroyed itself, slowly, over 2 years, one undelivered gown at a time. I had simply stopped standing in front of the wreckage, absorbing the blast so no one else had to see it. Sterling called that evening, his voice thin in a way I hadn't heard from him even during the worst of our own conversations. "She's asking me to help pay her legal fees," he said. "Camille," she called me crying, said she doesn't understand how this got so big, said all she did was ask for help with a struggling business, and now she's facing actual criminal charges over dresses that were late, not stolen. "Are you going to help her?" I asked, and I noticed, distantly, that my voice held no anger asking it. Only a kind of clinical curiosity, the same curiosity I might bring to watching how a competitor handled a crisis of their own making. "I don't have anything left to help her with," he said. "You know that better than anyone. The account's frozen. My savings are tied up in the divorce filing. I don't." He stopped, and I heard something crack in his voice that might have been the first real grief I'd heard from him since this began. "I don't know how to tell my mother that there's nothing left for me to fix this time." "Then don't tell her that," I said. "Tell her the truth, that some things were never actually broken by circumstance, Sterling. Some things were broken by choices, made slowly, over years, by people who assumed there would always be more where that came from. I think it's time this family learned the difference." He didn't respond to that, and I let the silence hold, because I understood, finally, that I no longer needed to fill it for him. The family meeting I called 2 weeks later was not the same kind of meeting as the first one, back in my kitchen, back when I had still been hoping some version of grace might soften what was coming. This one I held at Patricia's office, on neutral ground, with Patricia present, because I understood by then that grace, extended without limit, simply becomes a resource to exploit rather than a virtue to admire, and I was done teaching this family that lesson by example. Camille arrived pale and thinner than I'd ever seen her, out on bail pending her preliminary hearing, her lawyer beside her rather than her mother this time. Sterling sat apart from both of them, a man who had spent a month discovering exactly how alone a person can become once the structure they'd always taken for granted stops absorbing the weight of their choices. "I want to be direct," I said, once everyone had settled, because I had learned, over the past month, that directness costs far less than the alternative. "I'm not here to negotiate forgiveness. That was never on the table, and I think everyone in this room understands that by now. I'm here because Patricia has drafted a formal settlement covering the repayment of the $43,000 traced through the Buckhead lease, and separately, a repayment schedule for the venue funds Camille authorized through the LLC. I want both signed today. And if I can't pay it," Camille said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it, stripped entirely of the confidence that had once let her raise a champagne glass in my ballroom and call my success luck. "I'm potentially facing prison time. Evelyn. My lawyer says restitution matters for sentencing. I don't have $43,000. I barely have bail." I looked at her for a long moment, and I thought about 11. Now 14. Women who had trusted her with money they'd worked double shifts to save, women whose weddings had come and gone without the one small piece of beauty they'd been promised, women who had never once been offered the courtesy of being told the truth in time to protect themselves. "Then I'd start thinking about what you have left to sell," I said, the same way I once thought about it, 12 years ago, sitting at a folding table in a dining room, building something out of nothing because no one was going to build it for me. "I'm not asking you to do anything I didn't once have to do myself, Camille. I'm simply no longer willing to do it for you." The settlement conference ended without signatures. That day. Camille's lawyer requested 2 weeks to explore what he called alternative resolution options, and Patricia, ever pragmatic, agreed, because she understood, as I did, that a signature extracted under visible desperation rarely holds up as cleanly as one given with full understanding of the alternative. I used those 2 weeks to do something I had not yet allowed myself to do since the night of the rehearsal dinner. I stopped. Not entirely. Carrington Estate Holdings does not pause simply because its owner's personal life has become the subject of a regional news segment. But I blocked off 4 days, told Denise I was unreachable except for genuine emergencies, and drove 3 hours to a small cabin on Lake Lanier that I had bought 2 years earlier and visited perhaps 5 times since, always for a single overnight, always rushing back before I could let the quiet do what quiet does to a person who has spent her whole life avoiding stillness. I sat on the dock that first evening with a glass of wine I didn't finish, and I let myself, finally, grieve the marriage rather than simply litigate its aftermath. I had spent a month being precise, methodical, unshakable. And all of that precision had been real, had been necessary, but underneath it, I discovered, sitting alone by that quiet water, was a woman who had genuinely loved her husband for 12 years, who had built a life assuming it would hold, who now had to sit with the specific, private sorrow of understanding that the love had been real even as the trust beneath it had been slowly, silently hollowed out by choices she'd never been allowed to see. I let myself cry that first night in a way I hadn't let myself since this all began. Not the controlled 3 minutes I'd allowed myself in my kitchen the night Sterling left, but something longer, messier, entirely without an audience to perform composure for. And when it passed, sometime past midnight, I found something on the other side of it that surprised me, not emptiness, but a kind of clean, quiet relief, the relief of a woman who has finally stopped holding her breath waiting for a version of her marriage that was never coming back. I returned to the office on the 5th day with a clarity I hadn't had in a month, and I found, waiting on my desk, a letter that would reshape the rest of this story entirely. It was from Keisha Monroe. The nurse whose story had opened Sandra's original article, the woman whose $4,000 deposit had vanished into Camille's payroll 8 months before her wedding. She had written to thank me, carefully, for what she called finally being seen, and she had included, folded inside the letter, a photograph of her wedding day. A dress she'd bought secondhand 3 weeks before her ceremony, hemmed by her own mother at their kitchen table, because there had been no time and no money left for anything else. I sat with that photograph for a long time. I thought about the Windsor ballroom, the amber chandeliers, the magnolias flown in fresh that morning for a woman who had called me lucky. I thought about 14 women who had not been lucky, who had simply worked and saved and trusted, and been failed by someone who assumed, the way this entire family had always assumed of me, that there would always be more where their sacrifice came from. I called Denise into my office that afternoon with an idea that had been forming, quietly, since that letter arrived. I want to set up a fund, I told her. Not charity. Restitution, structured properly, through the company, for the brides Camille failed, above and beyond whatever the criminal case eventually recovers. I want every one of those 14 women made whole, whether or not Camille herself is ever able to pay a cent of it. Denise studied me for a moment. That's not cheap, Evelyn, and it's not your debt to pay. No, I said, it isn't, but I think, more than anything else in this whole ordeal, I understand exactly what it feels like to build something with your own hands and have someone else quietly hollow it out while you're not looking. I don't want to be the woman who only noticed when it happened to her. I want to be the woman who makes sure it doesn't simply disappear once it stops happening to her. We called it, eventually, the Monroe Fund, after Keisha, with her permission, and Sandra. Who had by then become something closer to a friend than a reporter. Wrote a second, smaller piece about it, one that did not need to name me at all, though of course, in a city as networked as Atlanta's wedding industry, everyone eventually knew exactly whose money it was. Camille's lawyer called Patricia the week the fund's existence became public, requesting, this time, an actual settlement meeting rather than another delay. I understood why immediately. The story had shifted, publicly and permanently, from wronged bride's family drama into something with a far less flattering shape for Camille. A woman who had stolen from working women while her sister-in-law, the one she'd humiliated in a ballroom, quietly paid to fix what she'd broken. I signed the final settlement 3 weeks later. Camille agreed to full restitution on the Windsor funds, structured over 5 years, secured against whatever remained of her family's assets, with the explicit understanding that the Monroe Fund would continue regardless, unlinked to whether she ever paid a single dollar of it herself. I did not attend her sentencing hearing 2 months after that, though Denise told me, gently, that Camille received 18 months, suspended to probation, and full restitution, given her lack of prior record and the scale of cooperation her lawyer eventually negotiated. I felt, reading the outcome in an email from Patricia. Something quieter than triumph and more durable than relief. The particular piece of a woman who understands that justice, when it finally arrives, rarely looks like a ballroom scene.It looks like paperwork, finally signed, finally honest, finally done. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in early spring, 6 months to the week after that rehearsal dinner toast, and I remember thinking, standing outside the courthouse afterward in the thin March sunlight, that the whole proceeding had taken less time than a single wedding I might host on any given Saturday at the Windsor. Sterling had not contested anything of substance. Patricia told me, privately, that his own attorney had advised him early on that fighting the settlement terms, the return of the $43,000, structured as a business fraud matter rather than a marital asset dispute, plus a clean division of everything else would build together, would only invite further scrutiny into exactly how the Buckhead lease had been financed, and Sterling, by then, had very little appetite left for scrutiny of any kind. I saw him only once more that spring, at the courthouse, in the hallway outside the room where our marriage was formally dissolved in under 9 minutes, by a judge who had clearly presided over 100 marriages, ending that same week, and felt no particular need to linger over ours. "I heard about the fund," he said, catching me by the elevator, his voice carrying none of its old confidence. "The one for the brides, that was a good thing you did, Evelyn. I don't think I ever really understood what you were capable of building, not really, not until I watched you build all of this instead." I looked at him for a long moment, this man I had loved for 12 years, who had once felt like the safest place I knew, and I found, standing there in that fluorescent-lit hallway, that I felt no cruelty toward him, no lingering need to make him smaller than he already felt, only a quiet, settled clarity. "I was always capable of it, Sterling," I said. "I just spent 12 years making myself small enough that you'd never have to notice how much bigger I actually was than the role you'd assigned me. I don't blame you for taking the space I kept offering you. I blame myself, a little, for never asking why I kept offering it." He didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't wait for one. I stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed on the last conversation I would ever have with the man I'd married at the county courthouse 14 years earlier, and I did not look back to see his face as they did. I threw myself into the business that spring the way I once had in my earliest years, before marriage and comfort had slowly, quietly, made me smaller than my own ambition. I opened a 4th venue that summer. The Ashford location's sister property, a restored 1920s ballroom in Charlotte. I'd had my eye on for 3 years, but never quite found the nerve, or the singular focus, to pursue while I was busy holding up a marriage that had already, unbeknownst to me, stopped holding up its half. Denise became a full partner in the business that fall, a title I should have given her years earlier, given how much of my company's actual survival had rested on her quiet competence while I was distracted managing everyone else's needs but my own. Patricia remained my lawyer and increasingly, something closer to a genuine friend, the kind who calls not just when there's a contract to review, but simply to ask how you're actually doing, and means it. Camille, I heard through the family's remaining, thinning channels of communication, had moved to her aunt's house in Savannah after her probation began, working retail to slowly chip away at her restitution payments. Her Instagram account permanently deleted, her name, I imagined, no longer trusted by a single bride in the greater Atlanta area. Ruth called me twice more that year, each time a little quieter, a little less certain of her footing, until finally, by winter, the calls simply stopped altogether, and I understood that whatever relationship had once existed between us had ended not with an argument, but with the quiet recognition, on both our parts, that there was nothing left to salvage from a family built on the assumption that I would always be the one absorbing its cost. I did not mourn that ending the way I once might have. I had spent so many years believing that family was a debt you paid regardless of what you received in return, and it took losing all of it. The marriage, the sister-in-law, the mother-in-law who had never once, in 12 years, asked how I was actually doing. To understand that family, real family, is supposed to be a mutual thing, not a one-directional withdrawal made against a woman who never gets to see her own balance. On the 1-year anniversary of the rehearsal dinner, I stood in the Windsor ballroom alone, early in the morning before my first site visit of the day, sunlight coming clean through the tall windows onto the same hardwood floor where Camille had once raised a glass and called my life's work luck. I thought about that night for a long moment. The toast, the laughter, the particular loneliness of being humiliated in a room I owned by people I had spent over a decade quietly holding up. Then I turned, and I walked toward my next appointment, because the past, I had learned, deserves exactly as much of your attention as it takes to understand it, and not one moment more. 2 years is enough time for a life to fully turn over into something new, if you let it, and I want to tell you about the morning I finally understood mine had. I was standing in the courtyard of my newest property. A converted botanical conservatory outside Savannah, glass walls and reclaimed ironwork, the kind of space that made brides go quiet the first time they walked through its doors. When my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in over a year, Ruth. I almost didn't answer. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for understanding how much had actually changed in me by then. 2 years earlier, I would have answered on the first ring, already rehearsing the apology I hadn't caused, already preparing to absorb whatever came next. Instead, I finished walking the length of the courtyard, checked the sight lines for the ceremony arch one more time, and called her back 20 minutes later, on my own schedule, for the first time in the entire history of our relationship. I wasn't sure you'd pick up, Ruth said, and her voice sounded older than I remembered, thinner. I almost didn't, I said, honestly. What can I do for you, Ruth? Camille's finished her restitution payments, she said. Last month. She wanted me to tell you herself, but she didn't think you'd want to hear from her directly, and I think she's right about that. She's doing better, working as a seamstress now. Actually. Real work, hemming and alterations for a shop in Savannah. She said to tell you she understands, now, what it actually costs to build something with your own hands. She said she thinks about that every day. I stood in that courtyard, glass walls catching the late afternoon light, and felt something in my chest that surprised me. Not forgiveness, exactly, because I had learned that forgiveness isn't a door you walk through once and are done with, but something quieter, more like acknowledgement. The particular relief of hearing that a person who once tried to diminish you has finally, on her own, discovered the weight of what she once called luck. I'm glad to hear she's found honest work, I said, and I meant it, though I made no move to offer more than that. No invitation to reconcile, no softening back into the family structure that had once required my silent endurance as its foundation. Thank you for telling me, Ruth. Is there any chance, Ruth said, and I heard her gather herself before she said it, that you'd ever consider. I know it's a lot to ask. I know I have no right. But is there any world where this family could find its way back to something? Someday, you built so much of what held us together for so long. I looked out at the ceremony space I'd built with my own hands, no husband's name on the deed, no family calendar behind me crowded with everyone's needs, but my own, and I answered as honestly and as gently as I knew how. I don't think so, Ruth, I said. Not because I'm angry anymore. I'm genuinely not most days. But I spent 12 years being the foundation this family stood on without ever being asked if the weight was sustainable. I don't think I'm interested in rebuilding a version of that relationship, even a gentler one. I wish Camille well. I mean that. But I think the kindest thing I can do for both of us now is let this family exist in the past, the way it actually was, rather than pretend it was something it never really got the chance to be. She didn't argue. I think, by then, some part of her had already expected that answer, had perhaps even respected it, the way people eventually come to respect boundaries they once tried and failed to erode. I hung up the phone and stood alone in the quiet of my newest venue, and I thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the loneliest years of my life had been the ones surrounded by the most people. A husband, a sister-in-law, a mother-in-law, a house full of holidays and obligations. And the fullest years had been the ones that began with a single toast in a ballroom that was supposed to humiliate me and instead, quietly, set me free. That evening, I drove back to Atlanta, back to the house I'd bought for myself the year after the divorce, small and entirely mine, no one's name on the deed, but my own. I made dinner for one, the way I'd made dinner for one most nights over the past 2 years, and for the first time in longer than I could remember. The solitude did not feel like something to fill. It felt like something I had finally fully earned. 6 months after that phone call with Ruth, I stood in the private dining room of a restaurant in Charleston, watching pastel light spill across white tablecloths, and I understood, for the first time in over 2 years, that I was building something entirely new. Not merely rebuilding what a marriage had left behind. Carrington Estate Holdings had grown into something I barely recognized from the company I'd nursed from a folding table in my old dining room. 5 venues now, spanning Atlanta, Charlotte, and Savannah, with a 6th under negotiation in Charleston, the very restaurant where I now stood scouting a potential acquisition. A converted rice mill along the waterfront, brick and cypress beams, the kind of raw, unfinished beauty that made me see, instantly, exactly what it could become. I had also begun something Denise had gently suggested, months earlier, sitting across from me in my office with the particular directness she'd earned the right to use with me by then. You built the Monroe Fund to help brides who got failed by someone they trusted, she'd said. What if you built something that helps women who want to do what you did? Build something of their own, from nothing, without a man's name required on the paperwork to make a bank take them seriously. The Carrington Foundation launched that spring. Small at first, a handful of microgrants and mentorship pairings for women starting service businesses in Georgia and the Carolinas, funded by a percentage of every wedding booked across our venues. I found, doing that work, a version of purpose I hadn't expected to feel again so fully. Not the purpose of surviving a betrayal, which had occupied nearly 2 years of my life by then, but the purpose of building towards something that had nothing to do with anyone who had once tried to diminish me. It was at one of the Foundation's early mentorship dinners that I met Marcus Devereaux. Not the accountant from Patricia's office, a different Marcus entirely, a restaurateur, who had built his own small empire of Southern-inspired supper clubs across 3 states, starting, as I had, from almost nothing. He sat across from me at a long table of grant recipients and mentors, and he asked me, an hour into the dinner, a question no one in my old life had thought to ask in longer than I could remember. What do you actually want next? He said, not for the business, for you. I sat with that question longer than I expected to, because I realized, turning it over, that I did not have a rehearsed answer for it the way I had rehearsed answers for nearly everything else in my life over the past 2 years. I think, I said finally, I want to find out what it feels like to build something with someone, rather than in spite of them. I want to be careful here, because I know how these stories are sometimes expected to end. A new man arriving to complete the picture, to prove that the real victory was finding love again. That is not what happened, and I don't want to tell it that way, because it wouldn't be honest. Marcus and I became, over the following year, careful friends first, and then something more, slowly, without urgency. 2 people who had each built their own foundations long before they ever needed anyone else's name on the deed. I did not need him to feel whole. I had already spent 2 years proving that to myself, alone, one venue, and one difficult truth at a time. What I found with him instead was simpler, and in its own way, more valuable. The quiet company of someone who had never once, in the entire time I'd known him, asked me to be smaller than what I'd built. I did not rush toward a wedding of my own that year, though people asked, inevitably, given the industry I worked in, whether irony would eventually demand one. I told them, honestly, that I had learned something important about weddings over the past 2 years, something I hadn't fully understood the first time I signed my own marriage certificate at a courthouse 14 years earlier. A wedding is a single beautiful day, built by professionals like me to be flawless and unforgettable. A marriage is the 12,000 ordinary days that come after it, built by 2 people who either choose, every day, to actually see each other, or slowly, quietly, stop. I intended, whenever I chose to walk down an aisle again, to make absolutely certain I was choosing someone who understood the difference. The acquisition of the old rice mill in Charleston closed that autumn, and I stood in its gutted, sunlit interior on the day the papers finalized, running my hand along exposed brick that had stood for over a century, and felt something settle into place that I want to try to describe carefully, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I had spent the first year after that rehearsal dinner consumed by what I privately called the reckoning. The methodical, patient work of making sure that every person who had quietly assumed my labor was theirs to spend without asking. Finally understood the true cost of what they'd taken. I do not regret a single part of that work. It was necessary. And it was just. And I would build the exact same structure again if I had to. But I want to be honest about something. The version of me standing in that rice mill finally understood, watching dust motes drift through century-old light. Revenge, even earned, even necessary, is not where a life gets to live permanently. It is a bridge you cross once, carefully, completely. And then you have to decide what waits for you on the other side of it. What waited for me, it turned out, was simply more of my own life, finally undivided. Camille reached out once more that winter, not through Ruth this time, but directly. A short, handwritten letter that arrived at my Atlanta office. No return address. Her new handwriting steadier than the loose, confident cursive I remembered from her signature on that long-ago venue contract. I don't expect you to write back, the letter read, and I'm not asking you to. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you built, because I'm trying to build something small of my own now, the honest way, one alteration at a time. And it is so much harder than I ever let myself imagine when I assumed you'd gotten lucky. I'm sorry it took losing everything to understand that. I hope, someday, whatever piece you've found is exactly as solid as it deserves to be. I read that letter twice, standing alone in my office, and then I folded it carefully and placed it, not in the documentation folder where so much of this story had once lived, but in a small drawer of my desk reserved for nothing in particular. The place where a person keeps things that no longer require action. Only acknowledgement. I did not write back. But I did not need to feel anger reading it either, and I understood, sitting there in the quiet of that afternoon, that this was its own kind of ending. Not reconciliation, not friendship restored, simply two women, who had once shared a family, finally telling each other the truth from a safe enough distance that neither of them had anything left to prove. The Foundation's first annual gala took place that December, in the newly restored rice mill, its brick walls strung with warm light, 60 small business grants awarded that single night to women across 3 states who reminded me, one after another, shaking my hand at the podium, of a version of myself I had nearly forgotten. 31 years old, working weekend shifts at other people's weddings, learning the business one contract at a time, certain, in the particular fierce way of a woman, with nothing yet to lose, that she would build something no one could ever again call luck. Marcus stood near the back of the room that night, not beside me at the podium, understanding, without needing to be told, that this moment belonged to the version of my life I had built entirely on my own. I found him afterward, near the tall windows overlooking the river, and he handed me a glass of wine and asked nothing of me at all. No performance, no explanation, simply his quiet, steady company, which I had learned, by then, to recognize as its own particular kind of gift. You built all of this, he said, gesturing at the room, the grant recipients still talking in small, hopeful clusters beneath the string lights, out of the worst night of your life. No, I said, and I meant it as precisely as I had ever meant anything. I built this in spite of the worst night of my life. The worst night only showed me how much I'd already built, quietly, 4 years, without ever letting myself notice. He smiled at that, and didn't press further, and we stood together at the window in comfortable silence, watching the river move slow and dark beyond the glass, and I understood, finally, standing there, that I had crossed all the way over whatever bridge that rehearsal dinner had first forced me onto, 2 years and 1 entire life ago. 3 years to the month after that rehearsal dinner toast, I stood once more in the Windsor ballroom. Not for a wedding this time, but for something I had never once done in the entire history of owning that building. I stood there for myself. It had started as Denise's idea, half joking, tossed out over coffee one morning as we reviewed the venue's calendar for the coming spring. You've hosted 400 weddings in this room, she said, and I don't think you've ever once let it be about you. Maybe it's time. I laughed it off at first, the way I laugh off most suggestions that ask me to occupy the center of attention rather than orchestrate it from just outside the frame. But the idea stayed with me, quietly, the way good ideas do. Until one evening in early spring, standing alone in that same ballroom checking sightlines for someone else's ceremony, I understood exactly what I wanted to do with it. Not a wedding. A gathering. The Foundation's 3rd annual gala, yes, but also, privately, something I'd never given myself permission to have, A room full of people who had chosen to be there because of who I'd actually become, rather than who I'd once quietly agreed to be for someone else's comfort. I invited Denise, of course, standing beside me now not as an employee, but as a full partner in every sense the word deserved. I invited Patricia, who had become, over 3 years, less a lawyer than a genuine friend, the kind who still called sometimes just to ask how I was, and meant it. I invited Sandra, whose reporting had cracked open a truth this entire family had spent years quietly burying, and who had become, unexpectedly, one of the people whose judgment I trusted most in the world. I invited 60 grant recipients from the foundation, women building their own version of what I'd built, one careful decision at a time, and I invited Marcus, who arrived not as an accessory to the evening, but as someone who understood, by then, exactly how much this room, this business, this version of my life belonged entirely to me, built with my own 2 hands, twice over now. Once in ignorance of what it would cost me, and once again in full, clear-eyed knowledge of exactly what it was worth. I gave a short speech that night, standing at the same spot in the Windsor ballroom where Camille had once raised a glass and called my success luck, and I told the room, honestly, the story I have been telling you. 3 years ago, I said, I stood in this exact room and was told, in front of 40 people, that everything I'd built was an accident that happened to me. I want to tell you what I've learned since then, because I think it matters more than any of the specifics of what happened. Luck is what people call your success when they've never once had to notice the cost of building it. And grace. The kind I spent 12 years mistaking for a virtue. Is not actually a virtue when it requires you to disappear in order to make everyone else comfortable. Real grace, I've learned, is quieter than that, and considerably more dangerous to anyone who's counting on your silence. It's the grace of a woman who finally decides that her own peace is worth exactly as much protecting as everyone else's comfort always was. The room was quiet for a moment after I finished, the particular quiet of people who have just heard something they didn't expect to be handed so plainly, and then Denise, standing near the back, began to clap. And the room followed, warm and sustained, and I stood there in the amber light of a ballroom I had built with my own hands twice, and let myself, finally, fully receive it. I did not think of Camille that night, not really, not with any of the weight her name had once carried. I thought instead of Keisha Monroe, whose second-hand wedding dress had started an entire fund now supporting women across 3 states. I thought of the 11, then 14, brides who had finally been made whole, not because a system had simply worked the way it should have, but because I had refused to let their pain disappear beneath a more convenient story, and I thought, finally, of the version of myself who had once stood in this room at 5:52 in the morning, coffee going cold, learning for the first time exactly how much she had been carrying alone. That woman, I understood now, had not been foolish for trusting so completely. She had simply not yet learned that trust, to survive, requires the same careful architecture as everything else worth building. Walls load-bearing enough to hold weight, but never so invisible that no one remembers they're there at all. The 4th anniversary of that rehearsal dinner arrived quietly, the way significant dates eventually do once they stop being wounds and become simply markers of how far a life has traveled. I did not mark it with any ceremony. I marked it, instead, the way I had come to mark most things that mattered most to me by then. By working, by building, by paying close attention to the ordinary architecture of a life I had finally finished rebuilding on my own terms. Marcus and I married that spring, quietly, at the rice mill in Charleston, the 2 of us and 11 people, who actually mattered rather than the 80 guests, an elaborate performance I had once orchestrated for other people's weddings for a living. I wore a simple ivory dress I designed myself, no veil, no aisle longer than the length of the room, and I understood, standing across from him as the small ceremony began, exactly what I had told those reporters years earlier when they'd asked whether irony would eventually demand I have a wedding of my own. A wedding is one beautiful day. A marriage is the thousands of ordinary ones that come after it, and I intended, this time, to enter mine with my eyes fully open, my name fully my own, and every account, every asset, every piece of paper structured in a way that meant no one, ever again, would be able to quietly draw against what I'd built without my full and equal knowledge. Patricia drafted the prenuptial agreement herself, thorough in the exact way I'd have expected from a woman who had spent 4 years helping me understand precisely how much protection matters. Even. Especially. When you believe completely in the person standing across from you. Marcus signed it without a single complaint. Understanding, I think, better than most people would have. Exactly why a woman who had built everything twice needed to protect it a third time, not out of fear, but out of hard-won wisdom. The foundation had grown, by then, into something I could barely have imagined the year Denise first suggested it over coffee. 80 grants awarded annually across 4 states, a mentorship network of nearly 200 women, and a small but growing endowment that Patricia assured me would outlast every one of us, quietly funding the ambitions of women neither of us would ever meet. I had stopped thinking of it as something built in response to Camille's fraud, or Sterling's betrayal, or any of the specific griefs that had once defined those early months. It had simply become, over time, the truest expression of everything I actually believed about building something real. That it should hold weight for more than just the person who built it, and that it should never, ever depend on anyone's silence to survive. I heard from Camille only once more, the spring of my wedding, a small card that arrived at my office with no request attached to it at all this time. Simply a congratulations, brief and sincere, and a small clipping from a Savannah newspaper. A feature on a young seamstress who had opened her own modest alterations shop after years of careful, honest work, finally out from under the restitution payments that had once defined every dollar she earned. I read the clipping once, felt something settle quietly into place that was neither forgiveness nor resentment, simply the closing of a very long chapter, and placed it, like her earlier letter, in the small drawer reserved for things that required no further action, only acknowledgement. Ruth did not attend the wedding. I had not expected her to, and I did not send an invitation, understanding, by then, that some bridges, once crossed, are meant to stay crossed rather than rebuilt simply because enough time has passed to make the crossing feel less raw. Some family, I had learned in the hardest possible way, is chosen rather than inherited, and I had built, over 4 years, an entire new architecture of people who had earned the right to stand in a room and call themselves mine. Denise, Patricia, Sandra, Marcus, 60 women across 3 states who had built something of their own with a grant I'd signed my name to. Standing at that small ceremony in the rice mill, sunlight coming warm through the tall windows onto exposed brick that had stood for over a century, I understood, finally, completely, the full shape of everything that had started with a single toast in a ballroom 5 years earlier. Camille had meant, that night, to remind a room full of people that my success was an accident, something that had simply happened to me rather than something I'd fought for with my own 2 hands. She could not have known, raising that glass, that she was about to hand me the single clearest proof I would ever receive of exactly how much power I had built, and exactly how long I had been too gracious to use it. I want to end this the way it began. Inside a room, watching light move across a floor I built with my own 2 hands, because I think that's where the truest part of this story has always lived, far more than in anything Camille said, or Sterling hid, or any of the paperwork it took to answer both. It is autumn now, 5 years since that rehearsal dinner, and I am standing on the terrace of a house that belongs to no one's name, but my own and Marcus's, chosen together, built on equal footing, no ledger between us that either of us needs to hide from the other. The foundation held its 5th gala last month, and I watched, from the podium, 100 women I'd helped fund stand and introduce themselves to each other, building small alliances that had nothing to do with me at all anymore. The way a good foundation is supposed to eventually stop needing the hand that poured it. I think sometimes about the woman who stood in that ballroom 5 years ago, smiling through a humiliation designed to make her small, driving home afterward with her hand steady on the wheel because she had already, quietly, begun deciding what she would do about it. I am proud of her, though I understand her now with a clarity she did not yet have for herself. She did not yet know that the real work waiting for her was not the reckoning itself, satisfying as it was to finally see every hidden ledger brought into daylight. The real work was learning, afterward, slowly, over years, how to build a life where no one's comfort required her invisibility ever again. Camille built something honest, eventually, out of the wreckage of what she tried to take from people who trusted her. Sterling, the last I heard through channels that no longer feel like mine to follow closely, remarried a woman 2 states away. And I hope, honestly, without irony, that he has learned something about what trust actually costs to maintain. Ruth and I never spoke again after that final phone call, and I have made peace with that particular ending. The way I have made peace with all the others. Not every bridge is meant to be walked back across. And some family, once it reveals what it always assumed you were for, cannot be revealed simply because enough time has passed. What I know now, standing on this terrace with a life I built twice. Once in trust, once in clarity. Is this. I was never lucky. I was never accidental. Every wall I built, every contract I wrote, every clause I buried in the fine print to protect a version of myself I didn't yet know I'd need protecting, was the work of a woman who understood, long before anyone else in that family ever bothered to notice, exactly what it costs to build something real. They called it luck the night they tried to take it from me. I call it, simply, mine.